Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar from Kelso Consulting, looking at how to build a business winning reputation. Firstly, to introduce myself, my name is Tim Prizeman. I'm director with Kelso Consulting. We're a long-established boutique public relations agency. My background is particularly in the B2B areas of financial, tech, professions, and I particularly work with businesses looking to build powerful reputations through getting more national media, national newspaper, business media coverage. We particularly work with businesses around helping them create high impact thought leadership campaigns. Indeed, I have a book on the subject. It's available on Amazon. It's scoring 5 stars, and a lot of people have said they've actually enjoyed reading it despite the dry title. Hint, hint, if you need something to read on a long flight or train journey. We've got a lot of people joined us who know Kelso Consulting already. A big welcome to you. We've also got a lot of people who this is the first time with Kelso Consulting, so a big welcome to you as well. And if you'll forgive me, I would just let you know a little bit about us. As we're a public relations agency, we would see ourselves as reputation builders. This is through helping businesses create and deliver campaigns that deliver the sorts of things that's going to have big influence with their key audiences, their key stakeholders. This certainly is most likely to include some high profile media coverage, but we also help people with important channels such as LinkedIn, getting awards to build their credibility, drafting case studies, getting speaking slots at events, drafting lots of articles and blogs, and of course, helping develop strong thought leadership so they stand out as experts in their area. A few housekeeping points. We'll be finishing in an hour. Please do send your questions through as we go along. Well, we'll certainly have a bit of time for questions at the end, and I'm always open to people ringing me up or sending me emails with questions. It's much better if I can deal with them on the slide or during the discussion while that topic's going on. And if you're thinking it, other people are thinking it. So do send them as we go along. In terms of what you'll get afterwards, straight after this, you'll get a little feedback questionnaire from my colleague, May. I'd be very grateful if you could fill this in so we can improve it for next time, and indeed make sure we retain the areas that people have particularly liked. You will get in the near future a podcast and a video of this as well, so you can watch it from a screen, or indeed you can download it for when you're driving or jogging around. Okay, so creating a business winning reputation. So it's simple in theory. You have a good communication strategy. An amazing one would be better, but a good will probably suffice if it's a plan that if you have a plan and then execute and deliver that plan well, so you implement it well, and then you review and repeat. All very simple in theory, yet so many problems within this. So what we're going to do for a big chunk of the webinar is concentrate on creating a good communications strategy. My observation with having dealt with a large number of businesses, spoken to a large number of people, a lot of the problem comes from not having a proper strategy, or indeed not having a strategy at all. We can then deal with questions around implementation, perhaps in the questions at the end. This is particularly because we've got a very wide range of businesses here. We've got some businesses which have been around over 100 years. We've got businesses on the joining us who haven't even been around 100 weeks. We've got some businesses which are small startups. We've got scale-ups. We've got mid-sized established businesses, and we're joined by some of Europe's very largest corporations as well. So clearly different sorts of challenges there. So I'd rather deal with those in questions to make sure we're dealing with the ones that are relevant to people online. So we'll be particularly dealing with the communication strategy, getting that right. So first of all, a communication strategy. Where does it fit in? And I think this is actually where a lot of businesses, particularly those in startup and scale up mode, go wrong, but not just them. And the position for a communication strategy is that it is the bit that communicates or helps deliver the business strategy and the business plan through tackling those elements where communication is key and informing not just the marketing and sales team, but all the other departments as well. And this is the first area where people often go wrong and see communications equals what the marketing and communications team does. Now, clearly, this isn't the case. In fact, I would suggest that the activity by your marketing and communications team, while perhaps quite prominent, is actually a very small amount of the total communications activity that your organization does. So that is first problem. And secondly, particularly when businesses are in sales mode, that could well be because they're starting and scaling up, but not necessarily, is that they mistake a communication strategy with their marcoms activity. Now, marcoms activity is all the day-to-day marketing communications. Clearly, these are very important. They're areas we do a lot of work with our clients on, but a communication strategy is not equivalent to your day-to-day marcoms activity. And while with many organizations, particularly in startup mode or growth mode, there will be a strong overlap of them, the two are actually very different, not very different, but the two are different and they have different purposes and different elements. So now I've used the word strategy a few times already, and it is certainly up there in the top 5 of the most used, abused, misused, misunderstood, misapplied business terms out there. Now, what is it? Now, if you do a Google of it, actually there's a whole range of definitions, none of which I felt were particularly helpful, because it could be a plan, a pattern, position, a ploy, a way of thinking. It can be all sorts of things. And we're going to be throwing that around. We're going to be throwing a lot of other terminology around. So I thought it would be worth just setting them out, what I'm saying. So you may not agree with me about some of these definitions, but at least you'll understand what I mean by them. So we're going to be talking a lot about objectives, which is just ultimately what you want to achieve. These could be very specific ones, or it could be vague ones. Clearly, for business purposes, the more specific, the better. When I'm talking about strategy, I'm talking about your broad approach for achieving your objectives. When I'm talking about plans, this is some sort of fairly specific timetable or series of activities to execute that strategy. When I'm talking about tactics, it's the specific actions within your plan. And when I'm talking about channels, which I have to say is a bit of business jargon I particularly dislike, but I'm going to end up using it inevitably, I'm talking about the different methods of reaching your stakeholders. So by channels, I'm talking about things like email is a channel because you use it as a method to directly talk to them. You might use advertising as a channel to them, whether it's advertising on posters, advertising in magazines. You might use public relations, as in press coverage, as a channel. You talk to journalists, they print something, your stakeholder reads it. Social media would be a channel, these sorts of things. Okay. So what would be the sorts of things that go into your communications strategy? And I think it's worth saying as well, in terms of building a business reputation, we are talking about the communications elements that you control for or have influence on. I'm not going to go off into all sorts of other areas that will affect your reputation, although you certainly need to have these somewhere within it. And indeed, the bigger the organization, the more you need to. For instance, you're never going to have a great business reputation if your product isn't very good, but we're not here to solve that element to it. You're not going to have a great reputation if you're poisoning the environment, or you have someone with a dodgy reputation as one of your senior directors. If you don't respond to a crisis well and have a good crisis communications plan, again, you are not going to have a good reputation. But these sorts of things, for the purposes of 1 hour webinar, are outside our discussion, as important as they are. So within the communication strategy, where you need to have, first of all, it needs to link with your business goals and the objectives. Now, again, sometimes I come across businesses where there isn't a business plan. There might be a financial plan, which is something like, we're going to raise our income and our billings and our whatever by XX%. But again, this is where people have already started to go wrong by confusing financial objectives with strategy. So you need business strategy with some goals that your communication strategy can start to help with delivering. You need to have identified within it your key stakeholders. And we'll come on to that a bit more, because again, I think this is an important area where vagueness at the start leads to problems and lack of success later on. You need to have some clear objectives for what the business wants to achieve with these. You need to have clear messages with these. And again, we'll be coming back to messages, because again, vagueness around these leads to lack of success later on. You'll be wanting to talk about the main channels for these, not every channel, but the main channel, and you'll need to be given some indication of how you will be assessing the impact. Now, many of the businesses on this will already have some sort of communication strategy. How can you tell that your strategy is either needed or that you need a better one? Well, there's a number of things I'm going to observe from this. First of all, overactivity. This is particularly common in startups, but it's not necessarily. Overactivity, new month, new initiative, new idea. It's the entrepreneurialism shows no bounds. And while we're all keen to have entrepreneurs with great energy and enthusiasm, if 1 month it's one objective, next month it's another, the people in his team cannot keep up, and nor can his customers. So that level of overactivity. This, in larger businesses, perhaps gets reflected in the idea that we're too busy to create a strategy. This probably is because they've got a whole load of other activity already in and they just want to deliver it, and then they'll think the strategy is something that they can come back to. My experience is most of this activity will be less successful because there's no strategy, and when they come to do a strategy, they'll regret doing large elements of those. In fact, when you're too busy for a strategy, that is the time you need one the most. So if anyone says to you, we're too busy for a strategy, it's a big red flag that you need one. A big problem is term staccato marketing I came across, which is particularly prevalent in professional firms, but not totally, where they're flat out on billable work, maybe with big project, they don't do any marketing, and suddenly the project ends or the client leaves and they've got nothing. So the marketing starts to build it. Client comes in, stops. All that work on that marketing is effectively left to weed over and become ineffective, because as we know, best marketing works through regularity and repetition. They come back to it, perhaps whether it's 6 months later, 18 months later, all the stuff they've done before has been largely forgotten, and they're reinventing the wheel again. A close ally of this is reactive marketing, where there's very little marketing, but suddenly maybe an advertising salesman pops up and he says, I've got a great offer. Why don't you do this ad for a knockdown price? Everyone goes, oh, we haven't done anything for a while. Sounds really good. Nothing really to assess it against, but hey ho, let's, sounds good, let's do it. Or it might be the journalist comes in, or it might just be whatever it is. But ultimately, everything is driven by other people's agenda, and it really depends. Everything sounds good, but what is it achieving? Probably not reinforcing it. A very common problem is that there are programs of activity around particular channels. You'll have a PR agency doing media relations, you'll have a social media person or a digital agency doing social media, you'll have somebody else doing search engine optimization, you'll have someone doing Google ads, you've probably got someone doing internal comms. Each channel has its own program that doesn't particularly reinforce or refer to the other one. If that's the case, you definitely need a strategy, because you're doing all this work and it's probably having very little effect, might be even cutting across each other. A big problem in the B2B area that drives lack of success is Me Too and unmemorable messaging. This is particularly the case with professional service firms. We'll be talking about why a strategy will be able to help with that. Allied to this, and usually actually hand in hand with this, is communication that spends its time talking about yourself. Me Too marketing, Me Too messaging, in law firms and accountancy firms, this is where all the PR and marketing and communications revolves around what you're doing. Charity sponsorships, winning awards, opening, getting new clients, all of these things. I'm not saying this is a bad thing for you to do, but where all your communications is about yourself rather than talking about the people you're trying to meet and the issues that are important to them. That is why you've got a communication strategy that people aren't particularly listening to. And ultimately, the effect of all this is if you can't get meetings with the people that matter, or you can't get, having met them, you can't get the second meeting with the people that matter, that is a very strong sign that there's something wrong with your communication strategy. By contrast, what does a communication strategy that works look like? Well, my observation is that firms with successful communication strategy, they might not actually be doing more activity, they might be doing less, but they concentrate on fewer initiatives that have a bigger impact, often because these are ones they've done before, they know they work, and they are able to repeat them and get all the benefits that come from repetition, familiarity, building on past foundations. A strong element of this is that they are able to align their channels. So one bit of activity is fed across a number of channels. That means they're not constantly having to come up with things to feed those channels, and it also means those channels reinforce each other. Their communication is differentiating themselves in a way that's meaningful for the people they're looking to influence. This is a lot of that is because they have messaging that resonates with the people they're trying to influence, stakeholders. This could be clients, this could be prospects, it could be investors, it could be recruits, regulators, whoever. And that's because they're talking about the issues that resonates and matter with their stakeholders, and all their communications has moved on from just being at quite a superficial level about building awareness or even getting the name out there, and it's moved into deeper, more emotional discussions about how they can build engagement, how they can build in trust, all of these sorts of things. Because ultimately, while we all want to think, particularly the professionals on the line, that buying is a cold, logical decision, but actually we know that it is emotional decision. Now, these might be impulsive emotions, or these might be hidden emotions about wanting to be safe and not lose face by recommending someone who is a risk, or who, when I say a risk, who ultimately you don't want a buying decision to backfire, so you go for safety. Whatever the emotional level it's done, ultimately most people at some level buy with emotion, justify with logic, not the other way around. So you're going to be there with your time, with your justifying to your team. Why bother with with the effort of creating a communication strategy, which we'll come on to in a minute? But as you'll have seen from what I've been talking about, even a very straightforward strategy ensures actually your activities reinforce. It ensures that you can prioritize activities. In fact, prioritizing activities potentially means you're able to do less but achieve more. Most organizations on here, and definitely everybody on here, will have a secret army of referrers, people in their network, all sorts of people who are actually very supportive to you and your organization. It could be alumni, it could be all sorts of people. You have a whole secret sales force and people out there building your reputation, or who will build your reputation if you are able to give them a lead. But again, the absence of strategy usually means they're there unable to or at least not giving you the support that they would like to do, and which is actually a huge and powerful resource for you. And of course, if you've got a clear strategy, it means less snafus and headaches, because everyone knows what the business wants them to achieve rather than they're guessing it. And ultimately, everyone has a reputation. Every business has a reputation. If you're not out there directing and managing it, You still have a reputation. It's probably, or it's definitely going to be less likely to be the one you want it to be. So you need to be attempting to influence it, because if you're not influencing that, you've still got a reputation, probably not the one you want. So, strategies, where do they go wrong? And particularly with communication strategy. Now, I've mentioned earlier that often the first thing is people confuse strategy with things like financial goals, vague visions, objectives, ambitions. So first of all, you need to be clear that when someone says this is our strategy, they are actually talking about some sort of meaningful thing that's going to give direction to people, rather than just saying, oh, we're going to, our strategy is to be number one in the market. Well, isn't it for everybody? But how is that actually going to be achieved? That's really an objective or even a vision. What is the strategy that's going to achieve it? A big problem with strategies, not that it's a problem in itself, but it does mean it's not going to be very successful, is businesses having a strategy that's pretty much the same as everyone else in the market. This typically comes from a lack of either creativity or maybe just not enough time spending on it. For instance, in the legal sector, virtually every commercial law firm has an employment law department. They're all full of smart, well-qualified people. They're all going to have a session where they say something like, we want to be better known, we should be commenting in the media on employment law cases. So if they're all doing that, what is it that is going to make some of them more successful than others? Well, good implementation is going to help, but ultimately you can't have a strategy that's based around everyone else is going to mess it up and you're not. What is it a bit about your strategy, your communication strategy, that's going to put you ahead of at least a large proportion of all your other competitors? And it will be the same for your market. Your market has intelligent people. They've all got access to similar information to you. They've all probably got similar objectives. What is it about your strategy that is going to allow you to stand out against them? Now, clearly, poor implementation is where a lot of ones go wrong, but often it's simply because the strategy and the plan contains a large amount of fluff that should have been removed through a hard-headed process. And part of that fluff, certainly I come across a lot, and we've got a lot of professional firms on here, it stems from an inadequate, not necessarily an inadequate understanding of stakeholders, although that could be part of it, but it's a failure to segment and have messaging that's particularly applicable to each of them. So, for instance, a lot of accountancy firms say, we are going, our target, we work with SME businesses, so our stakeholder is the owner of an SME business. Now, that's okay as a starting point, but there's hundreds of thousands of SME businesses. And there's a very big difference between for instance, a one-person startup that's probably going to stay a one-person startup, a one-person who's ambitious and is going to scale up, a business that's been around for 100 years and employs 50 people, or maybe a tech company that started 10 years ago and employs 70 people and is already trading all over the world. These are all very different types of businesses, very different types of business owner, and yet they all get lumped together, which of course means messaging that's going to apply to all of these people is going to be weak and vague, because none of them have anything in common with each other than a very loose categorization by the firm that's targeting them. So clearly, if you've got fluffy segmentation, fluffy understanding of people, broad categorizations which are convenient for you but mean nothing to the people you're targeting, your communication strategy is going to go badly from the start, because you're never going to get messaging, offering, language that appeals to each of those sorts of groups. So a communication strategy, how do you create it? Now, there's all sorts of books and things like this on this, but so I'm only going to offer a few thoughts, but ultimately you want some sort of statement of purpose, or in this case, the business strategy, the marketing strategy. What is it you're looking to achieve? You want to have a good understanding of your current situation. You'll probably have done a pest analysis, a SWOT analysis. I'm not going to go through defining all of these things. Most people will be familiar with these, Wikipedia or lots of books on Amazon otherwise. You want to develop some clear communications objectives from your business objectives. You want to go through your stakeholders. If you're already starting to hit problems along the lines of those I've discussed earlier, of vagueness around stakeholders, over broadness with them, leading to problems around fluffy and generic messages, or messages that sound exactly like your competitors, these are the sorts of areas you need to be tackling in your strategy process. You having been much clearer and more specific about them, you need to talk about how you will evaluate success, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then you can start talking about your key communications methods. I want to mention creativity and lateral thinking. Now, this actually needs to be part and parcel of the process before. It's very easy for people to think creativity and lateral thinking is something the marketing team or whoever will sprinkle some stardust on later in the process, once you've decided that you want to appeal to every SME within 100 miles of your office. But actually, it needs to be much earlier in there, not necessarily creativity in terms of pretty clever images and colourful logos, but in terms of thinking more creatively about who your stakeholders are, what are the messages, getting to understand them. Now, many businesses, they don't have this creativity within the management team. This isn't a reflection on the management team's quality. It just means they've been close to the problem for a long time and can't see the wood for the trees. Creative people have exactly the same problem in their own businesses, which is why the marketing by many creative businesses isn't very creative. But what you need to bring in is to identify, whether from externally or from elsewhere within the business, who is going to be able to bring in that creative facilitation to help the management team effectively challenge hidden assumptions, identify them, look at things with a different process, different perspective. Who is going to be that? And that is particularly important, because otherwise it's going to be a very logical process. It's going to be the same process you've been through before, your competitors have been through before, and you're all going to end up in the same place. A few bits I want to go back on. So I just want to really reiterate that your business objectives need to be clear, they need to be smart. If business objectives aren't, then the communications and the marketing activity is really going to struggle. So, and I've been plenty of places where they've said to me, come up with a communication strategy, and I've asked for this and it's not existed. Clearly, people can busk for a little bit of time, but ultimately, if you can't have a clear business objective, it's asking a lot of everyone else to be able to fall into line without getting that leadership. If the general can't tell the army what they want to do, they're not really going to be able to win the battle. The same for businesses. Stakeholders. You really need to be ensuring that you have clear segmentation. Now, don't just be superficial about it as well. Who are your stakeholders? Now, it's very easy for businesses to fall into the rut of equating businesses to the person they have the sales meeting with. Now, clearly, those people are really important decision makers. They are going to be very important for you. But who are the people that influence them? I will give an example. Once upon a time, mid-tier accountancy firms actually did audit FTSE 100, FTSE 250 companies. Quite frankly, there's probably a lot of finance directors who would like to use them, but they've almost been eliminated from that market. Why? Well, it's because non-executives, investors, and people like that have taken a dim view of them, fairly or unfairly, probably very unfairly, and ultimately finance directors and other people haven't wanted to argue the case for them and have fallen into line and said, we'll go with a big four. Now, that is a very big example, but played out over several years, but there will be analogies within the organizations you're talking to about who else do they want to see, and it might, who else do you need to have the endorsement of, or how do you position yourself so that the person you're dealing with feels able to recommend you to other influencers and not either be overruled by them or fear putting forward something that will rebound on them. So you need to think carefully about stakeholders. Now, these might be regulators, these might be investors, these might be non-executives, these might be, quite frankly, in some businesses, it's their spouses and their family and friends. But who are the people that are stakeholders and audiences and important in the decision-making process? And you need to have them you need to have your stakeholders segmented, you need to have them prioritized, because clearly you can't reach everybody, but you need to be identifying the most important. And what you need to do for at least your priority ones is have personas for them. Now, I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail on this because a lot of people will be familiar with the idea of having personas or avatars that give color, that allow you to be able to talk in the sorts of languages and really get underneath the skin of these people to understand what's important for them. If you're not familiar with these terms, drop me an email afterwards and I'll send you some useful links. But ultimately, you need to have personas of these, not least so that when you're briefing the marketing team, the digital agency, the HR training, the HR department's ad agency that writes job ads, whoever it is, you can say, these are our messages. Oh, and by the way, these are some of the stakeholders. These are the people we're aiming at, and help them to understand it. Because if you say SME owner, they might, you might think someone in their 50s who is running an established business. They might think SME owner, okay, that equals millennial tech company owner, because maybe that's who they're used to dealing with, as opposed to who you are thinking of targeting. Messaging. Now, my view, and indeed my, I would argue from my experience, people who spend more time understanding their stakeholders and what they want to achieve are more successful at developing messaging that resonates with them. Your messaging, either way, I would say you need to think big about it. You need to keep it simple. It needs to be memorable. It needs to aim at both the head and the heart. It definitely shouldn't be a list of your services or some sort of product description. And if your messaging sounds like any of those, I strongly argue you need to revisit it. You'll be able to make a decision whether it's because of poor direction, poor strategy, not spending enough time on it, or maybe the need for a bit of creative input to do it. But ultimately, if you look at a lot of accountancy firms, they all say the same thing. Some accountancy firms, though, if you look at them, they've made the effort, and actually they say things, they say, they're ultimately similar accounting firms, but they say it in a much more powerful and memorable way. The same for law firms, the same for consultancy firms, the same for tech firms. Tech firms are particularly guilty of this because they talk about their technology when they talk to the people who buy it, ultimately, particularly if they're SME people, really don't care about the technology other than they want it to be simple to use, reliable, work, all of these sorts of things. What they want to know is, how does this help me solve my big problems, and what extra value are you going to be delivering that I can leverage as I grow my business? I think it's also particularly just veering off into a little bit of communications theory, because what you've got to remember is what you think you say ultimately isn't what people probably hear. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the encoding, decoding, and interference, but ultimately what you say, I'll give an example. A lot of professional firms say something like, we're a long established firm and can trace our heritage back over 100 years. What they think they are saying is, we are reliable, established, and successful for being around such a long period of time, so you can trust us. Now, some people may well hear that, but other people might hear old and fuddy-duddy. How do you know if they're hearing that? Well, by thinking about your particular stakeholder and understanding them more. The same very much applies to tech firms. tech firms say something like, we have a new and leading edge technology, and they think people are hearing something like, wow, that will give me a big advantage, whereas what most buyers are hearing is risky and unproven. So again, you've got to think about whether what you think you're saying is what people are ultimately hearing. And there's only one way to find that out, and that's to understand them and then to test messages on them. So I've talked a little bit about creativity and lateral thinking. To my mind, this is ultimately the thing that's going to make your communication strategy different and more successful. If you're in a completely new area that's growing like Topsy, you can probably get away without creativity because people are in buying mode. But most people here on this market are in on this call are in a relatively mature market. They need creativity and lateral thinking, not just around messaging, but about how they approach things as well. Ultimately, where in your plan is this? So, evaluating communication success. Now, this is a big problem for many areas, and I can't go in and offer up a magic way of doing it, given the wide variety of businesses. Please do come back in questions or discuss this with me afterwards. But ultimately, you need to be differentiating between what I would call output measures, which is what do you do? Are you having 28 ads? Are you having 30 press releases? Are you having 3 events? Are you having 50 meetings with prospects? What that sort of output, and ultimately without output, you're not going to achieve anything. But you need to know what you're doing. What sort of activity is this generating? Is it generating sales meetings, generating engagement on websites and things like this, sales inquiries, all of these sorts of things, and outcome? And ultimately, communication is all about changing attitudes that change behaviors. Now, this is clearly going to be a much bigger and harder area to measure. It's more long term, but ultimately, what are the behaviors you want from each of your stakeholders? How is that changing? You can survey people and other ways of finding out how their attitudes are changing. Now, for small startups, that's a very big question, a very different matter, probably to the large companies on the line. Much better if we deal with this as specific questions afterwards. But ultimately, you need to have some sort of metrics that reflect your priority stakeholders and the behavioral changes that you want. So, to sum up, how do you know if you've got a good communication strategy? It will have a big message at the heart. It will appeal both to the heart and to the head. It will be different from your competitors, not different by a sliver, but significantly different. It's definitely going to be something that has to work in the real world. If it's all fallen apart and you've launched this strategy and no one in your organization is doing it, or it's not achieving any results, maybe it's the implementation, maybe it's the strategy, but either way, there's a big problem there. And it needs to be a strategy that isn't completely obvious and intuitive. So you need to get your team, your secret army of referrers and fans and alumni to do it. What is it that's going to make it successful in the implementation? Well, the easier you make it for them, the more likely they are to play a full and active role. They need to understand why. the key messages, they need to have them. You need to be repeating them. They need to be really clear and memorable. Proof points are very important. It's not just the why. We're in a skeptical world. It's the prove it to me. If your message is we're a leading expert in this area, where are the proof points to it? Give people template material. This isn't just for people internally, this is for referrers as well. If a referrer, if you're able to provide material that a referrer is able to forward on, that and they want to forward it on, that makes it much easier. This is how social media works. People like to share stuff that reflects well on them. The better the stuff you're generating, the more social media works. You do need to have a proper launch, rollout and cascade. Don't just send an email to people saying, here's the plan, get on with it. Think a bit more about how it's going to be done. People are going to need training in these areas. There's, within professional firms, there's a huge imposter syndrome thing. No one's going to admit they need training. No one's going to admit they can't do it. So how is your problem going to be overcome? You're going to have to get that out there with the training and accept that no one's going to ask for it. But ultimately, if they're not doing things, they're going to, you've got to realize that there's this whole imposter syndrome out there, and they won't admit that they don't have the skills. And of course, people need resources to achieve all of these things. This might be resources in terms of time, material, support from you, support from in-house team, support from external resources. But ultimately, you need to make sure the key areas have resources. And don't forget, it's very easy to talk to a few people, tell them what to do, move on, but make sure that it's been rolled out properly across suppliers, across alumni. For most of the businesses here, there needs to be almost certainly a much stronger focus on referrers than you are doing. One or two clients have put a particular focus on referrers, and it's been hugely successful in terms of generating extra work for them. Yes, you probably think you're doing a lot with referrers. I can strongly suggest it's still, there's more that can be done, and they are people who, if they're referring work to you already or have referred work to you in the past, they are a particular area to focus on. And when things are going well, people are doing things correctly, don't forget, particularly at a senior management level, to be mentioning people in dispatches, praising success internally. It's very easy within the partnership and other management cultures to think people are doing their job, so what, let them get on with it. But actually, professional people are hugely motivated by praise. Praise is cheap, and yet it's more motivational to most people, maybe not salespeople, but most people, than financial rewards. So make sure that that whole feedback thing is going on. So, in summary, and please do send through final questions. As Sun Tzu, the oft-quoted Chinese general, said, tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. That doesn't mean you need to spend weeks and weeks and weeks coming up with a strategy, but it does mean you do need to invest time to get one right, and that will be time well spent. It's all about bringing clarity, not complexity. When you develop your strategy, particularly people in professional firms and startups, you've got to remember, you are not the customer. The amount of communications I come across where people are clearly marketing to themselves, and rather than marketing to the people who are the buyers, is a very common problem. And remember that communications is something that goes on across the whole organization, not just what the people in your comms team are doing. So we'll be coming on to questions in a second. Last chance to, well, not last chance, but here is a big call to send through further ones, as we are almost there on time. Just to let you know, before we go through those, Kelso Consulting, we clearly get involved with these with our clients in a large number of ways, and we're always happy to help other businesses as well. We facilitate brainstorms and creative message sessions with clients, or as in with particular projects. We bring in an external perspective and help organizations create powerful communication strategies. Often organizations need strong thought leadership as part of their campaigns. We very much help with that, and indeed we help with full creation and delivery of PR campaigns to help clients build reputation, whether it's through the media or across other channels such as LinkedIn, awards, that sort of thing. And there's the sorts of services you would probably expect from a PR agency, but also maybe some services you wouldn't expect from there around awards, LinkedIn. In the case of the law firms online, we also help with directory entries, with FT Innovative Awards entries, that sort of thing. Okay. Questions? Tim, are you willing to share any tips or tricks to get your stakeholders, including staff or contractors, to buy into an overall communications strategy? Well, yes, I mean, I think we covered a few of those, but I think the key thing was certainly with contractors is to bring them in more, invest more time with them. Definitely when you have a strategy, and with sharing it with them, launching it with them, spending a bit of time to talk with them about what it means in the area of their particular responsibility, but also get people involved earlier in the process. This could be earlier in the strategy process, or it could be earlier in the implementation process. I think there's plenty of PR people on here who will at some point in their career have been told, here is a really interesting announcement, we've drafted it all up, could you put it out tomorrow? Only for them to think, yes, that is an interesting announcement, but it's missing all the key details. And if you had asked me, I'd have suggested last week, because that topic was going to be in the news, rather than now. Everyone's covered it, world has moved on, and it's not going to get the impact it could or should have done. I dare say digital marketing, people with digital marketing backgrounds have had the same encounter, and I dare say people with all sorts of backgrounds have come across this in their own time. So the more you can start to share the plan and involve people in the plan, and indeed get their input to improve it, but also by doing it that you get them to feel more ownership of it, more buy-in to it, and more likelihood that they're going to put in that extra effort to implement it rather than go through the motions. Okay, We are there on time. Other questions will be tackled as in blogs. Just to let you know that we have further webinars coming up. We've talked a bit about thought leadership. Implementing thought leadership campaigns so you can stand out as experts in your area is very important for many of the business online. We will be tackling that at a much more nitty-gritty how to do it level in our webinar in a month's time in February. For the tech businesses, we'll also be doing one on successful blogging, how to implement a successful blogging. A lot of tech businesses, SaaS businesses, want to get to the top of Google. Part of that is a content strategy. A lot of that is around blogs. Yet, dare I say, a lot of the blogs, first of all, coming up with the blogs is a perennial problem. And many of them, they might have lots of keywords in, but they're quite, dare I say, superficial and don't engage and people that read them. So we're going to be talking about how tech companies can blog better, but without lots of hassle. We're doing the same for law firms as well in March. And we also have some webinars which are available to watch now. One on making Google ads, where I've been joined by a Google ads specialist, Dominic Renshaw, who talks about how to make Google ads work for professional and consultancy businesses. And my observation is too few businesses use these in their campaigns. And we've got one about how to specifically about how to get international media. Thank you very much for joining me. Look out for our emails with the feedback form and the recordings to share with your colleagues or to listen to when you are jogging. Hope you enjoy the rest of the day, and thank you very much for joining me.